This is a response to Once Forgiven Now Free's video, Evolution is Stupid. This response was initiated by the YouTuber Frank's Voice, who recently paid a couple of kind visits to my channel in order to defecate textually in my comments section. Now, I'd vaguely heard of this user before and needless to say was intrigued, so I clicked my way over to his page and that's where I found a mirror of your video. I have to say that I was initially dumbstruck by the contents of your production because it may represent an all-new low point in creationist dishonesty, and considering the competition you're up against, that really did take some doing. Because of the sheer magnitude of your quite astonishing duplicity, I felt a moral obligation not to let it ride and instead to take the time to point out what a devious and insincere little Christian you are. Now, before we begin, I should mention that I am aware that you have an aversion to colourful language. So I want to warn you that because your video contains such mind-bogglingly outrageous deceit, it got me a little hot under the collar and I may not be able to control myself during this rebuttal. If you therefore don't like what you hear, might I suggest that you ask your friend Frank to keep his voice down in the future, or better still, just shut the fuck up completely. So with that, let's take a look at what you had to say in your video and why it pissed me off.
Was the cell designed? Well, let me help you out. Was this car designed? Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, that is not a fair analogy. One is living, the other is not. And you would be correct, it is not a fair analogy.
Well, that was innocuous enough. It was also nice to see that you're more than aware of the flaw in this analogy that creationists have been beating mercilessly for years, despite it having shuffled off this mortal coil a long time ago. Living systems can maintain homeostasis via a variety of physiological mechanisms and so can adapt to their environment and repair themselves. Additionally, they're capable of imperfect replication. Genetic variation caused by germline mutations, chromosomal crossing over during meiosis, and the recombination of parental alleles following gamete fusion leads to phenotypic variation in the resulting progeny. This variation acts as the feedstock for natural selection, which ensures that organisms displaying inherited traits that make them better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce and therefore pass on these traits to their offspring. Over periods measured in millions of years, this process leads inexorably to the continued divergence of species as they adapt to constantly changing ecological niches and ensures that they remain beautifully adapted to their respective environments. In contrast, a car which can't do anything other than sit where it's been parked is capable of doing nothing other than slowly turning into a pile of rust. The resulting intricacy and complexity produced by evolutionary processes generates the appearance of conscious design in organisms and yet is magnificently explained by the simple yet elegant conceptual framework known as evolutionary theory. This theory weaves together countless millions of pieces of independent physical evidence into a robust and coherent explanation of why and how organisms have diverged to produce the staggeringly vast array of life forms on planet Earth today. It also abolishes the need to invoke the existence of an invisible and undetectable designer that poofs each creature into being from thin air. Science has definitively demonstrated that if a designer does exist, it works from the bottom up, not the top down, and uses physical evolutionary processes to accomplish its end and not tawdry magic tricks. However, for those who are too stupid, too indolent, too apathetic, or too wedded to their primitive belief systems to learn anything about this process, it's presumably too difficult to conclude anything other than it all being the result of the cosmic equivalent of a cheesy Las Vegas variety act.
It is not a fair analogy because the living cell is much more complicated than the car. The car analogy does not do the cell justice.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Do you really expect anyone to take you seriously when you go and say something this misleading, this underhanded, and this devious? You've just attempted one of the slimiest tricks I've ever seen a creationist try to pull, one that's only worthy of a sneaky, mendacious little tosser of the first order. Of course, calling you that would be impolite in the extreme, so I'll restrict myself to saying that you should be as ashamed of yourself as your God would be if he existed. And if that seems a little harsh, then consider this. You ooze your way onto YouTube and present a tired and tatty argument against perhaps the most sublime accomplishment of the human intellect, and then admit that you're aware of why what you've shown is nothing more than a steaming pile of malodorous fecal matter. The decent thing to do in this situation is to either shut the fuck up immediately or to actually present a new and logical counter to the said refutation. Unfortunately, neither of these options was good enough for you, and instead you chose to merely skip over the problem and restate your fallacious argument while adding a few extra turds to it to make the pile seem all the more impressive. Unfortunately for you, your analogy still fails for the same reason regardless of the actual magnitude of the difference in complexities of living cells and automobiles, and your pathetic and painfully transparent attempt at giving it the kiss of life has done nothing other than give you a terminal case of halitosis.
So the thing is, if you can't believe that unguided laws of nature can produce vehicles, how could you possibly believe that they can build living things, which are way more complicated?
Because I, unlike you, understand and accept that there's a fundamental difference between living organisms and inanimate objects. You, of course, have demonstrated that you also understand this, but you're either intellectually crippled enough not to pursue the logic and the mountains of evidence to their rational conclusion, or intellectually bankrupt enough to ignore the gaping hole in your piss-poor excuse for an argument. Vehicles are not produced by unguided laws of nature because they cannot reproduce and are therefore not subject to Darwin's principle of descent with modification. Living organisms, on the other hand, can and are and so can evolve complexity using mechanisms that are extremely well documented and understood by science. And while this process might indeed seem unguided in that it isn't reaching for some unseen goal, it's not the entirely random and directionless mechanism that you're presumably implying it is. Just because you're unable or unwilling to look into or acknowledge the way in which science can explain how these systems develop doesn't make your argument any more compelling. It just serves to demonstrate how ignorant or dishonest you are. If you want to be treated with a little more respect, then it'd serve you well to try and criticize the specifics of what evolutionary theory actually says instead of borrowing someone else's threadbare straw man and frenziedly whipping it until you've run out of both breath and common decency.
But it gets worse. If you are an atheist, then you are actually compelled to believe that cars are formed naturally by nature. Why? Because on your view, nature is all there is.
It's very nice of you to take the time to tell atheists what they must believe and save them the bother of thinking for themselves. It would have, however, been more helpful if you'd expended some thought on the matter before arrogantly opening your mouth and acting as if the material that came out of it was shinola and not what it actually sounded and smelled like. Firstly, atheists aren't compelled to believe anything about the origins of General Motors or any other motor vehicle manufacturer. They merely don't accept the existence of your or any other passing loon's God, and may or may not accept the existence of any God at all depending on their level of agnosticism. They may do this after a great deal of thought and consideration, or because perhaps like you they refuse to think at all. But in either case, their views on the supernatural have nothing to do with their views on crankshafts and valve cover gaskets. Secondly, rationalists, if that's what you mean by atheists, accept only what's indicated by the evidence presented. This acceptance is always tentative and subject to modification or withdrawal pending the production of contradictory data. At present, everything happens to indicate that nature is all there is, since no evidence to support the existence of the supernatural in general and your special friend in particular has ever been forthcoming. In the absence of any evidence to explain a given physical phenomenon, such rationalists do the intellectually honest thing and use the label "I don't know" pending more information instead of filling the gaps in their knowledge with psychological comforting fluff and labeling it truth.
If you want to call yourself an atheist, then you have to believe that the four fundamental forces of nature can produce cars, computers, spaceships, and televisions. Now you might be thinking, but that's stupid.
You're right, I am. That was stupid. And dishonest in the extreme. Repeating the same misrepresentation doesn't make it any less repugnant or incorrect no matter how many times you do it. Your little game should by now be obvious to anyone who takes the time to look at your video with anything even vaguely resembling an open mind. All you've done is construct a painfully transparent appeal to ridicule, presenting a patently ludicrous scenario that ignores the entire palace of knowledge erected by science that explains in great detail how this could have and probably did occur. In a certain sense, these laws did eventually produce vehicles, but it took them almost 14 billion years to do so, and then only after sentient beings that were capable of producing such designs had evolved. This is hardly the spontaneous assembly that you're implying is posited by evolutionary theory, and in reality the only people who claim that life can pop into existence out of nothing are creationists. If you really want to disprove evolutionary theory, then try doing the decent thing and debate against the actual evidence that supports it instead of constructing a deliberately misleading and inaccurate proposition and trying to pass it off as more than just the intellectual skid mark that it is.
And you would be absolutely right. And that is why I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
So you can't be an atheist because you can't bring yourself to accept the preposterously laughable straw man you just presented. I don't blame you, because arguments of that quality are about as likely to have persuaded Mother Teresa to take up stripping as they are of convincing a rationalist that evolution is incorrect and that invisible, undetectable magic pixies are real. In reality, the veracity of evolutionary theory should have nothing to do with anyone's stance on the existence or non-existence of deities. All that science has done is provide essentially incontrovertible evidence of how life on this planet has diversified, but says nothing as to whether a god or collection of gods were involved in setting the ball in motion. As a result, there are still enough gaps in our knowledge at present to accommodate your special chum without you having to behave like a mentally incompetent or dishonest simpleton. But that's not what you really mean, is it? What you're really saying is that you can't or won't accept evolution because it's completely incompatible with the laughably childish myths in your holy book, and that you're either unable or unwilling to relinquish them, even though that means having to deny reality to the point of psychosis. I've come to this conclusion because on your channel page you claim to be a mechanical engineer and so should be more than intellectually capable of comprehending the evidence that you're distorting so flippantly. The fact that you're either unaware of or willing to lie about it speaks volumes about the magnitude of the cognitive dissonance reverberating around inside your head. As a final example of how low you're willing to sink to cling to your psychological safety blanket, let's take a look at how you finished off your video.
Then the intestines move back, and of course then the diaphragm can contract quite easily.
So this is a piston?
This is a piston. Beautifully done. Couldn't be more beautifully designed. Evolved.
Yeah.
Has it occurred to you that the gentleman in this clip may have corrected himself because he was more than aware that the world's full of despicable, two-faced creationist scumbags who'd be more than willing to jump onto his words like anemic vampires onto a used tampon and use them against him? Alternatively, he could equally well have been being ironic in expressing how evolution is more than capable of producing creatures that to all intents and purposes superficially appear to be intentionally designed to fit their habitats. Without seeing this clip in the full context of the program from which it was culled, I can't distinguish between these two and yet other possibilities, but I can be certain of one thing, and that's that you didn't catch him in the act of revealing some kind of global scientific conspiracy aimed at perpetuating evolutionary theory at the expense of your pathetic little children's bedtime stories. Your eagerness to jump feet first into the slime to take this unbelievably lame and pathetic cheap shot only serves to showcase the dishonorable depths to which you're happy to plunge to protect your beliefs, and the outrageous lies that you're more than willing to spread to defend them. If this kind of sordid and tawdry behavior is the best you can offer, if you're truly incapable of rational debate and honesty, if all you have is quote mining, misrepresentation and character assassination, then that speaks volumes more about your position and your beliefs than I or anyone else ever could.